In 1937, ruins were unearthed during construction next to the famous Roman Colosseum. It took archaeologists 20 years to excavate the site, but what they found shocked them. It was a gladiator training school, the largest one in all of Rome. They named it Ludus Magnus and determined it was built in the 1st century by Emperor Domitian. But it was more than just a gladiator training school. Men would live here full time, and their only job was to fight, day in and day out. They would train in preparation for the ultimate challenge, gladiatorial combat in Rome's Colosseum, connected with underground tunnels to Ludus Magnus. But the famous Colosseum in Rome wasn't the only place gladiators would fight. There were around 230 arenas scattered throughout the empire, but it was definitely the biggest and most important. So the men who lived and trained at Ludus Magnus were the best of the best. By all accounts, and with this new archaeological discovery, it seemed like the sport was growing more popular than ever. So why did it suddenly die in the year 399? Gladiators were first introduced to Rome in 264 BCE. They were professional fighters, but many of them were also slaves, prisoners of war, or criminals. But it wasn't just those who were forced into it. Some chose to become gladiators for the glory and the fame, because the most successful gladiators became Roman heroes. Though many gladiators did die in battle, some were actually able to earn their freedom by winning. Gladiators who fought for at least 3 years could earn the Rudius, a wooden sword that symbolized their new lives as free men. But it wasn't just slaves who became gladiators. Even politicians would join voluntarily to gain respect. The most famous was Emperor Commodus, the same Commodus portrayed in the film Gladiator, who fought at the Colosseum a lot, sometimes dressed as Hercules to establish dominance and control over his people. By connecting himself to the gods, he was legitimizing his rule over Rome. So, the Colosseum was built between the years 70 and 80 CE, the earlier years of the Roman Empire. Though most Roman amphitheaters were built into the hillsides, the Colosseum was freestanding and built to seat over 50,000 spectators. Ludus Magnus was built right after the Colosseum was completed, supplied the gladiators who fought each other in intense hand-to-hand combat. But it wasn't only gladiator fights at the Colosseum. They would host fights between men and exotic beasts. They'd flood the entire stage to perform mock naval battles, and even public executions. The idea was to entertain the people of Rome, and the best way to do that was with violence. But why? Well, the Roman poet Juvenal wrote a collection of poems called the Satires, and in one of them, he said the common people don't care about personal freedoms. They only care about bread and circuses, food and entertainment. As long as the people were fed, and as long as they were entertained, they would be happy. So the leaders of Rome adopted that idea, and in 140 BCE, way before the Colosseum was even built, they passed laws that gave out free grain to the people and free access to entertainment like gladiator shows and dramas, all paid for by the government of Rome. But it was more than just keeping people fed and happy. It was a political move. As Rome grew in size and population, politicians had to fight to gain power and influence. The bread and circuses catered to poor people, and with that, gladiatorial combat became really popular until something almost shut it down. Rome was keeping its people happy with their food and entertainment, but not all of the enslaved gladiators were willing to risk their lives for 3 years to get freedom. In 73 BCE, around 70 gladiators escaped from a training school at Amphitheatro Campano, the first Roman amphitheater and training grounds. The revolt was led by Spartacus, a man who many historians believe was once in the Roman army. He was sold into slavery and sent to the Amphitheatro Campano gladiator barracks, where he was forced to fight alongside other gladiators, entertaining the people. But soon after his arrival, Spartacus led a revolution by first stealing knives out of the barracks kitchen. As word spread, more Roman slaves from all over the Republic joined him, totaling somewhere around 100,000 men. It was an obvious threat to Rome. What good were the bread and circuses when the gladiators themselves are rebelling? So in what later became known as the Gladiator War, also the Third Servile War, Spartacus and his followers roamed across Italy for 2 years, raiding towns, killing Roman legions, and moving closer to the heart of Rome itself. But Spartacus and the other slaves were eventually defeated by General Marcus Crassus in 71 BCE. Those who survived were captured and crucified by the Roman army. But it was the most successful slave rebellion in Roman history, and one that was a serious threat to the whole republic. So, even though the rebellion was stopped, Spartacus had put the entire future of the gladiator sport at risk. But luckily for the Romans, who loved their bread and circuses, the revolt didn't kill the sport. Instead, they put new restrictions in place, like the sheer number of gladiators. Since they were typically slaves, the total number that one man could own was capped at 320 pairs. Their access to weapons was also severely limited in an attempt to prevent another rebellion. For example, they used to give them swords hours before a fight. Instead, they gave them seconds before they stepped into the arena. So, gladiatorial combat continued and even grew. So why did it all end? Well, it wasn't another Spartacus. The exact opposite type of person ended Rome's most iconic sport. Christianity first appeared in Rome around the 30s CE, though it didn't become official until Emperor Theodosius made it the state religion 350 years later. Throughout this time, though, Rome was becoming increasingly more Christian, but still clung to some pagan traditions. Gladiatorial combat, still a popular form of entertainment later in the 4th century, was considered a relic of the old Rome. Christian thinkers condemned the games as brutal and violent, and the continued state financing of these expensive games was leading to severe economic problems. But more than just that, gladiator games usually ended in a brutal death. In an increasingly Christianized society, was it right to have one man kill another just for people's entertainment? Christian writer Tertullian wrote that death by combat in the Colosseum was murder, plain and simple, and Christians witnessing this murder were doing spiritual and moral damage to themselves. He went on to say that the gladiator was an instrument of pagan human sacrifice. But despite all this, the games continued. People still showed up en masse for their time-honored bread and circuses. But then one man stepped in between two gladiators in battle, trying to stop the violence, so the whole sport was on the brink of collapse. His name was Telemachus, now a Roman saint. He walked in between two fighting gladiators. Telemachus was determined to end what he considered to be an anti-Christian pagan ritual. Sources differ on how Telemachus died, but he was either stabbed by one of the gladiators or stoned to death by the crowd, who was angry at the interruption. Once Telemachus died, though, the people had a change of heart. The crowd left the arena, the gladiators dropped their weapons, and the day was done. Emperor Honorius then heard about Telemachus's martyrdom and how he had sacrificed himself to stop the violence of gladiatorial combat, and Emperor Honorius, himself a Christian, decided the games could no longer continue. Though a previous Christian emperor, Constantine, had officially banned gladiator fights in 325, it wasn't until Honorius closed all the remaining gladiator schools in 399 that the sport died. The final gladiator fight took place January 1st, 404.